Hello YouTube! Welcome to the third video in this React testing series. During this video, we are going to create our first tests using Jest and React testing library. I will divide this video into three different parts. The first part, we are going to learn about React testing library and do a small introduction to it, to see how we can grab elements from the screen, how we can click in buttons, for example, that are on the screen, so how we can interact with whatever is on the screen. Then, in the second part of this video, I will start to add tests to a component we already did here on the channel around 8 or 9 months ago. It's a very simple component, but it will show you all my workflow of how I think about tests for a component that already exists. And that might be the current situation you are in at the moment. You have a lot of components in your company without a single test, and you want to start to add tests into it. Then, the third part of this video, we will start to add features into that component that is already fully tested. So when we add a new feature, we will follow TDD. And what does that mean? It means test-driven development. We will start to add a test, and that test will fail because we don't have implementation for that test yet, for the new feature, okay? Then we will go to the component, we will implement whatever code we need to implement in order to pass that test. Depending on the code quality that we achieve at that moment, we might want to refactor that, having the confidence that our test is already passing. And if our test is still passing after that refactoring, we know we improved the code quality, keeping the confidence that our feature is still working as expected. And that is usually known as red when the test fails, green when the test passes, and then we do refactor. So red, green, refactor. And that is a pattern that you will read quite a lot in the testing community. I will probably speak about it a few more times during the videos in this series. So it's probably two terms that you should be familiar with, TDD and red-green refactor. Even though if you don't know those names, nothing bad happens to you, okay? And you don't need to follow TDD for every single component you do, okay? A lot of people don't follow TDD and they are very good developers as well. So this is more of a choice that I like to have when I'm doing new development, but you are not forced to follow that by any means, okay? Now, let's jump into the introduction for React testing library and what it is trying to achieve. And I think the main goal for React testing library, as you can see over here in their problem description, is that they are trying to test the React components we have without relying too much on implementation details. And if you are doing React for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, you probably were on the React ecosystem when we were using class components. And if you were using tools like Enzyme allow us to go very deeply and check the state of the component and a lot of internal implementation details. When React introduced function components, a lot of people, myself included, they got burned completely because their tests at that moment were kinda useless and not helpful to do the transition from components in class components to function components because we were testing too many implementation details. That's more of a problem of we as developers than Enzyme itself, even though Enzyme allowed us to do that. And React testing library doesn't even allow you to go much deeper into the implementation details. And that's one of the goals that they have over here in the solution. And I love this sentence from them. They say, the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. 100% agree with that, okay? So if we were testing at the time React class components with React testing library, our components will have worked exactly the same and passed exactly the same tests when we move to function components. So our tests would have give us the confidence to move forward. And in my case, they didn't give me much confidence, partly because of Enzyme, partly because I did the tests in a wrong way, okay? So I'm here to teach you what I learned in that situation during these videos and also make sure that you don't make the same mistakes I did, okay? So going a bit deeper in React testing library, one of the first things that you will need to do is to grab elements from the screen, or as we usually say, query elements from the screen, or select elements from the screen, right? And React testing library provides us with a lot of nice queries for that. One of the ones that you will see people using quite a lot are these get by role and get by text, okay? And if you are used to have an ID in an element and just do document.querySelector by an ID, that is usually not the best approach. And that's the latest approach or the last approach that React testing library tells you to do, is this by test ID. You will see a lot of tutorials using that, but please avoid using that, because that means that your component is not testing for accessibility. When you use, for example, get by role, what we are doing over here is that we are grabbing an element by a role, for example, a button, and then we are saying that the accessible text for that button needs to be, for example, save. And that is a very good test. You are not relying in stuff that your users can't see. If you are worried about all of these query methods that we have here on the left, don't worry. React Testing Library have you covered over here. They have a website called Testing Playground that you can just drop your HTML on the top left corner, and I will apologize for people that are in mobile, but there is not much I can do right now. I will try still to zoom this and move around, but it's not easy, okay? So basically what we have over here is that you will drop whatever HTML you have here at the top left, and then at the top bottom, you can have the queries that are being happening. And what that means, you can click, for example, in this enter email, and when you click there, you will see that it will create the query for you. Here on the right bottom of the screen, you can see the queries by their priority. And you can see that the test IDs is usually the least priority that you can use. I can even come over here and I will just create something called data test ID equals to Bruno, for example. And now I will grab that element. And as you can see, that element will be grabbed by Bruno. And you can see that we can do screen.getTestID. But this is not the optimal query that you should use. Knowing that these things exist and they are here to help you out, let's jump into code and start to add our first tests to our component. Over here in VS Code, I already have the counter we created in that video over there. I will usually recommend that you don't look into the implementation details before you add the tests. And the main reason for that is that I found myself, every time I look into a component that has a bug, usually I will be so biased already by reading the implementation code that I will code my tests taking that bug into consideration as it is the right way to work. So if in your company you have already documentation on how that component or how that page should work, do your tests based on that documentation or on that specification rather than the implementation of the component. If you don't have, then you have no other option. Now, let's just see how this component works. And as you can see, when this component starts, we have the current counter as 0. This can be our first test. Then, when we click on the plus, it will go to 1. We can refresh the page and click on the minus, and it will go to -1. So those two are already, well, in reality, 3 good tests. The first one is when the component starts, it has a counter as 0. The second one is when we click the plus, it goes to 1. And the third test is when we click the minus, it goes to -1. So the first thing we need to do is to create a new file called counter.spec.ts. If you prefer, instead of calling it spec, you can call it .test. It's completely up to you. Usually I like spec more, but nothing wrong with test. And the same thing will apply to our it. Basically, you can have it or test. And as you can see, test is just syntactic sugar to the it. So whichever you want to use, they are exactly the same thing. Usually I go to the it because it's just shorter. But depending on your team, don't create a fight because of that. Use whatever your team is already using and be happy, okay? Now, I will just start to create a very rough description. And at this first stage, in my workflow, I really don't care that much if the words are correct or not. I will just put something there, and then we will refactor that description in the future to make it better and easier for other developers to understand. So I will come over here and I will say default count equals to 0 and plus clicked, then counter equals to 1, right? This is my first test, and in order for this, I will just do a to-do, and I will just create another test. And the next test will be very similar to this one, but I will say the minus, and the counter should be -1. I can even add another test for now, where I will say default count is 0, then counter counter should be 1. And as I said, we will refactor this test in a little bit. So don't worry too much that the first description you put is very ugly. Don't worry about it for now. I will come back at it in a minute or two. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is remove one of those to-dos, and I will do the following. Put a function over here, and we will render our component. And the first thing we are going to do is to import our counter. And now we will do that the default count will be 0, and the description will be something for now. Let's call it my counter, for example. Okay? And now you need to test two things. You need to test that my counter will be 0, and I also need to test that I have my counter, right? So let's come over here, and let's just copy this current count -1, and we will do the following. We will import the screen from React testing library, and the screen is what will allow us to have those queries. So we will do the following: query.getByText, and we will just grab that text. So when the component starts, we will have the current count as 0. And then we can also do the following: getByText, and I can say that we will have my counter somewhere on the screen, right? And because it can be somewhere on the screen, I will just pass a regular expression for it. Now, this getByText and most of the queries, they will accept regular expressions. If you are very familiar with regular expressions, that's good. If you are not, I will leave some links into the description for you to learn a little bit about regular expressions. I'm also not a specialist on it, but some that you will find very interesting is, for example, when you want to be in variable case. So for example, if I don't mind that someone has my or whatever, you can just pass this invariant, and this is invariant casing, okay? This is something that I use quite frequently. In this case, I will not use, because I really want to test that the M is capitalized and the C is capitalized. If you don't care, put the I after, okay? Now, or I can put the I, and you see it when I commit to the repository, you have both there. Now, I have that bit there. Now, the only thing we need to do is to just do the following: expect this bit to be in the document. And for the ones of you that already use React testing library, you know that this query over here, if for whatever reason the element, this current count 0, is not on the screen, it will immediately throw an exception failing our test. So in reality, you can just keep it like this. But for readability purposes, usually we just do this: expect this bit to be in the document, okay? But if you are doing other stuff, like for example, if you have an element and then you are doing, for example, this, and you are doing l.click, for example, you don't need to be checking every single time that you use that getByText that the element is on the screen, because if it is not, it will throw an exception. Now, with that being said, I can just copy this line and just change whatever I have inside it and put my counter, and we can just run this test to see if we are now working. I can just do this in lowercase, so you have a better example. I will just do that, and immediately after, you will then start to ask me, hey Bruno, but that means that you will copy this first line again into this test and once again into that test? Yes, for now I will, and then we will do the refactoring at the same time that we'll do the refactoring of the text, okay? So when you use to-dos, just for you to show you something, when you use to-dos, one very good thing is that the to-dos will show with this purple color over here. So you can see that you have to-dos still in your test. Well, to-do, I'm repeating the word to-do too many times now, but you can see it clearly on your tests that you have those over here. Now, the next test, we will do exactly the same thing. I will remove the to-do from there, and I will just do the following. I will do this, And now we want to click on that plus button. So the way that we can click on that plus button is to do the following: fire event dot click, and now we need to pass the button over here. So we can once again use the screen, and we will, instead of using get by text, this time we will do get by role. And get by role will allow us to tell our query engine that we want a button. So that's what we are going to do. We will use a button. And I don't know if you noticed, but when I'm doing this, you have all the possible options over here with autocomplete. Okay, so you don't need to memorize them. You can just loop through and see which is the role you want or you need. In this case, we want the role button, and the name, for now, it will be a plus. This is not very accessible, so we will improve that in a little bit. But for now, let's keep the plus over there, and I will click that button. The next thing I want is to just grab the text when the counter is 1. So I can just copy this text, it's just easier. And I will do the following: expect screen.getByText to be that, to be in the document, right? And as you can see, we are starting to already repeat our first line. We will repeat our first line once again there, then I will refactor before we keep adding tests. So I can do once again a test, and when you do that test, we will now have 2 tests passing, and we will have 1 to do. Now that those to-dos are there, now that that to-do is there, we can just remove that to-do, and as you can see, we will do something very, very similar. So I will just do a little copy-paste to save you time, because I know you don't have all day to watch me coding over here, and I will just click on the minus, and I will expect this to be -1. So I will just do npm t, and you will see that when you start to have a little bit of practice with testing, you will start to see a lot of patterns that you can start to copy and use and stuff like that. So don't worry too much about those things. Now, this is the moment that I will start to see, okay, I have this bit that is replicated, and so I want to make a grouping. And when we do a grouping, usually we do the groupings by a describe, okay? This is where we will do logical tests that are similar inside the same grouping. And I will do the following: initialized with default count equals to 0, and description equals to my counter, okay? And now the way we can run this line all the time before each of those tests is to use something called before each. And this before each will run every time before any it that we have inside these describe. Okay, so in this case, if I copy these three its over here, these before each will run before any of those. Okay, so in this case, because this is the same line we are running everywhere, I can just do that. I can now remove that line. I can also remove this line. I can format this code, and you will see that now, if I just remove a little bit this space, I will have those components with just 2 lines over here. And you can even split this test into another it, because usually it makes sense to have its own test. So I will just say renders title as, my counter. Okay, and we will just do the following, and renders default count, renders current count to 0. And this is the moment that you will start to refactor the text, because one of the things I like in my tests is to have some kind of story. When I'm reading this, I want this to be kind of a story. So I will usually create even a top definition with the counter, okay? And I will do the following. And I will copy this, put this at the bottom, and then I will start to read this to see if it makes sense. I will read the following. The counter initialized with count equals to 0 and description equals to my counter renders current count to 0. Reading all of that thing again, renders the title as, renders title as that thing. And now we will say when when plus is clicked, when plus is clicked, I will put the plus inside there, and you can even do a before each here, because you can do a lot more tests then. So I can even grab this bit over there. And now if in the future you want to do more tests after you click the plus button, you are allowed to do those tests now, because this test is just renders current count to 1, right? And this is literally what you want. I can even copy this and overwrite the previous for the minus, because they will be exactly the same. And I will do minus over here. And I will just go -1 and -1. Now that you are seeing these tests over here, you start to see that in the future, when we want to have another grouping for tests for initialized with, for example, -1, and we want to click on the minus and go to -2, for example, we know exactly in which sections to go. I don't need to basically have a huge list of tests. The tests are by sections, let's say it that way. And in my opinion, it helps quite a lot for you to read the tests you have. One of the things that I was saying that I want to have, and this is a little bit of the third part, because this is already kind of a feature, is when we have that plus, that bit is not that much accessible, right? This is not accessible. A person reading this with just a screen reader will not get much value from that. So we can say something like this: subtract from counter or subtract counter, something like that, right? And on this one, we will do something like add to counter, for example. And I can think about better text while I'm coding and speaking, but if I remember about a better text, I might create another commit to the repository. The good thing about this is when I have this thing, I can now go to my test, and instead of grabbing the element by the minus, I will grab all my elements by that bit. So I can come over here and I will grab it by that description. And this one, I will grab it by the add to counter. So I will come over here and I will do, oops, I did it the opposite way. Good job, Bruno. We can change the description. It's just easier. It's just easier to change the descriptions at this stage, right? So basically, now when I run my tests, you will see that my tests are there and are running exactly as expected. Now that we already have some tests in our component, we can feel brave to add a new feature, and we will add that feature by a TDD approach, test-driven development. You can feel free to go to our component and add more of those edge cases. And as you already saw, it will be mostly copy-paste from those tests to start at -1 or to start at -10 and test those edge cases. Now, what we want to test for this new feature is to have a new text box over here called incrementer, and if the incrementer is, for example, 5, every time we click plus, instead of going from 0 to 1, it will go from 0 to 5. The same will happen when we click on the minus, going from 0 to -5, for example. If the incrementer was 10, we will have gone to 10 and to -10. Now, how can we do that in terms of test-driven development? Well, we can come over here and I can do a bit of your homework already and start by copying this bit of our component and just start it as, for example, 10, okay? And so you have a bit of your homework already done, and I will just do www as the initial counter, and then we can start to add our text box and click on the plus icon to then check. So let me just do www over here, and I can just do www. So you have a bit of your homework already done, okay? Now, what we can do is to create a new describe over here, and in this describe, what we are going to do will be to, when the incrementer changes to 5, for example, and plus button is clicked, okay? when that happens, we will have a before each in order to literally go to the input field and change it to 5, and then we will have another fire event.click to click on the plus button. Okay, now our it will be to render the count as 15 in this case, because we are saying that the incrementer will be 5 and our counter will start at 10. Now, how can we just type something into an input field? You can use the fire event like we used before, but it's a bit too much pain to do that because we need to create our own event with a target and a value. So the testing library ecosystem provides us with something called from testing library / user event. Okay, and oops, this should be user. In reality, you can call this user anything you want. I like to call it user because then I can retest like user click here, user types there, and it's easier for my brain to associate that. So I will do the following, the user.type, and as you can see, this user event has a lot of stuff already pre-made for us. One of those is the same click we were using before as the fire event. So we can go ahead in a few seconds and replace all those fire event by these new user events. But then you have a lot of stuff like tabs. You can click on a tab when you are in a form and the cursor and the focus will change to another input field. You have all those events over here. I would say 99% of the events you ever need are all in these user events, so you don't need to play around with the fire event, okay? Even though it's good for you to know they exist, because if you need something very extreme, the fire events will be your escape hatch, let's say, okay? So let's say type, and now I will grab my input field by screen.get by label, and the label we will have for it will be incrementer, for example, and then I will just type, for example, 5 in my incrementer. And after I do that, I can do user.click, and I will do screen.get by role button, and I don't even remember what we called our plus button. So let me just come over here to the bottom and just copy these add to counter. So we have that add to counter, and now we are already adding to the counter. And after we add to the counter, we are expecting our current counter to be 15. As you may imagine, our test will even fail on our first line here because there is nothing in our component called incrementer yet. So we will not even find it. Now, what can we do? We can come into our implementation while our test is still running. And as you can see, we have that test that failed. And the main reason is it was not even able to find that incrementer. So that's all good. Let's go now to our component, and we are already here, and we can do the following label, and we will do an input, and that input we will say type to be number, and in the name we will say incrementer, for example, right? And this test, by the way, will now fail because I am asking the label to be only incrementer, and now my label is incrementer with a column. So I need to come into my test and say, okay, it can be as long as incrementer is there. I'm very happy. So now this first line will work. I can even run that first line for you. And after that first line works, we can click on the add button, but now this will fail. Sadly, at the moment, this one will fail. I can come over here, and as you can see, it failed because the current count is still 11. We didn't implement anything. Let's start to do that implementation now. Let me come over here, and I will do the following. Incrementer, set incrementer equals to use state of the incrementer starts as 1, and we will just do the following. Value equals to incrementer, the on change will just be an event, and I will just do the following. Set incrementer, I will do parse int of the event dot target dot value, and if we don't have anything into our input field, we will have the value 0. Now, if I run that, I'm sure it will still fail for another reason, and the reason is because I think we will have the number 15 into our text field, because I didn't delete anything from there. Let me just check. Yes, our input field still has the number 15 right now. And so we are doing something wrong with this input. And what is the reason? If you come over here, and now I have this, I will replicate what's happening. I'm clicking there, and then I'm doing 15. So I first need to select everything and click 5. Luckily, this user event already has something like that. Let me go to the user event to show you. And you have quite a few things. One of them that I use quite a lot is the enter. And you have a few things to add special actions with your keyboard. You can add spaces, you can click on the ESC, you can do a backspace. The one that we want for now, I will say, is to select everything and then type 5. So we can come over here, go to our test once again, and instead of just typing 5, we will select all, and then we will click 5. Still, our test will fail because we are not taking into account anything over here. We don't care. We are not caring yet about the incrementer here. We are just doing 1. So we need to come over here, do incrementer, and we will also need to do the incrementer for the minus, even though I shouldn't do this already. I should keep it as 1, test the plus, then test the minus will fail and come back here. But sometimes we just run ahead of ourselves, right? And I do that quite a lot, but just to keep it correct to the TDD approach, let's just do one by one at a time, okay? So now this test will fail. Well, this test will pass and something else failed. What did fail? It was our www. And what was the reason for our www to fail? Okay, it makes sense. If you see, what we have over here is desk and then www. So I don't care about the desk. We can just pass our regular expression again to just have www somewhere into that string. I will run the test, and now my test will pass once again. I can come over here and then start to have our test for the minus. And as you will see, our test for the minus could be just a copy paste from this one, or because we are going to keep this 5, I will probably do something very similar to this one. We could keep this one and add another describe, or we can take the decision to copy this one and just say that the incrementer is, for example, now 10. And if the incrementer is now 10 or 15, for example, we can just do, for example, 25 just to avoid that bug with the 15, okay? So let's say that now our incrementer is 25. So when we click in the subtract button, let me just go over here to copy the subtract to counter. So clicking to subtract the button, right? So when we click to subtract the button, we will have the counter starting at 10, which is where we are starting. And if we remove 25, we will have 15 negative ones, right? And that is very good. We can come over here, click on the npmt, and we should have one more test now failing. And this one will fail because we are not using the counter into our test. So we should have 9 over here. We will come over here, and now, yes, we will do the incrementer. Of course, if you are then in a real application, I'm sure you will not be doing like these very small increments going back and forward between your unit tests. At least I don't. As I was already doing, I would have done this incrementer directly there, okay? And then I will go back and add the test after. So don't take the fact that people tell you to do TDD as you have always to do the test first. Sometimes I don't do it, then we can argue that's not TDD anymore, and fair enough, right? But just pick something that makes you feel very productive. And as I said, for homework, if you want to go deeper in this type of testing, you can go ahead and start to first change these 5 events to start to use our user.click, for example, right? And I can just do that and run the test for you to see that it still works. But just go ahead, start to add more edge cases, start to play with other stuff that is in that component that you want to test. For example, another thing that I would test if this was a real world application was to just with another test for this DC to be, for example, 10 in that scenario where we have 10. So there are a small edge cases here that you might want to test as well. Now, as homework, if you want to go deeper on this, start to think about more edge cases. You can start to have new features into this component, for example, saying that it can only go up to 10. So when you reach the number 10 and you click again, you are stuck at number 10, for example. Now, with that being said, if you want to move already to video number 4, which is a video that we are going to learn about asynchronous testing. So for example, if you have code that doesn't run immediately, for example, with a set timeout, or you are doing an HTTP call, your code will not run immediately. It will only run whenever that HTTP call is finalized. You need to do some different strategies over here, and we will just do that in video number 4 over there. If you like this one, please like the video, and I see you very, very soon in the next one or in one of the videos of the playlist over there. Take care. Bye-bye.